Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, letting these stories carry you into the night. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Cleveland was a city of immigrants and dreamers, of steel mills and shipping yards, of people who believed that hard work could still lead to something better. The Cuyahoga River cut through the industrial heart of the city, its waters reflecting the smoke from countless chimneys. Downtown, the Terminal Tower stood as a beacon of progress, the second tallest building in the world at the time. It was a symbol that Cleveland mattered, that this city on the lake could compete with New York and Chicago. But beneath this veneer of industrial prosperity, another Cleveland existed. In the flats, where the river wound through the city, transient camps sprawled in the shadows of bridges and rail yards. Hobos and unemployed men gathered around barrel fires, sharing whatever food they could scrounge. Kingsbury Run, a ravine that cut through the east side of the city, had become home to dozens of makeshift shanties. These were Cleveland's forgotten people living on the margins, invisible to the city planners and politicians who spoke so confidently about recovery and renewal. It was in these first something evil began to stir. On September 5, 1935, two young boys were playing on a hillside in Kingsbury Run. The late summer sun was warm on their faces as they ran through the tall grass, looking for treasure the way boys do, a lost coin. An interesting rock, anything that might spark their imagination. They were far from the nearest houses, in a wild area where few adults ventured. It was their secret playground, their escape from the crowded streets and tenement apartments. One of the boys spotted something pale in the weeds about 30 feet down the slope. At first, he thought it might be a department store mannequin, the kind he'd seen in shop windows downtown. But something about it didn't look quite right. The color was wrong, too organic, too real. He called out to his friend, and together they moved closer, curious but increasingly uneasy. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was a human body, but not whole. The torso was pale and waxy, lying on its back in the underbrush. But there was no head, no arms, no legs. Just the central trunk of what had once been a person, discarded like refuse in this wild ravine. The boys stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. This wasn't supposed to be real. Things like this didn't happen in Cleveland. Not in their neighborhood, not in their secret playground. One of the boys broke into a run, scrambling up the hillside toward the nearest house, his friend following close behind. They burst into the home of a stranger, breathless and terrified, trying to explain what they'd found. The homeowner, seeing the genuine fear in their eyes, called the police immediately. Within an hour, Kingsbury Run was swarming with police officers and detectives. The area around the body was cordoned off with rope. Photographers documented the scene from every angle. The Cleveland Police Department had dealt with murders before. This was a major industrial city with all the crime that came with it. But nothing quite like this. The deliberate dismemberment, the careful disposal, the complete absence of identification spoke to something far more sinister than a typical homicide. Detective Orley May was one of the first senior investigators on scene. A veteran of the department, he'd seen bar fights turn fatal, domestic disputes end in tragedy, and robbery victims who'd fought back at the wrong moment. But this was different. The body had been cut apart with precision, almost surgical precision. Whoever did this new anatomy understood how joints connected, how to separate limbs from torso with minimal damage. This wasn't frenzied violence. This was methodical, controlled, planned. As the sun began to set over Kingsbury Run, casting long shadows across the crime scene, Detective May looked at the partial remains and felt a cold certainty settle over him. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This wasn't a crime of passion that had spiraled out of control. This was something else entirely. Something that suggested a mind operating on principles most people couldn't comprehend. He had no idea how right he was, or how many more bodies would be found before this nightmare ended. But even as police worked the scene that September evening, there was something they didn't yet know, something that would make this discovery even more horrifying. This wasn't the first victim. The killer had struck before, and the evidence had been lying undiscovered for over a year. Just 30 feet away from where the boys had found the male torso, officers searching the area discovered another body. This one was more decomposed, partially skeletonized by a year of exposure to the elements. It was also headless, limbless, reduced to a torso that had been castrated and drained of blood before being dumped in the ravine. The vegetation growing around her, since at least the previous summer. 2 separate times, same location, same method. The implications were staggering. Detective May organized a systematic search of the entire ravine. Officers moved in a grid pattern through Kingsbury Run, poking through underbrush, searching beneath debris, checking every shadowed hollow. As darkness fell, they brought in portable lights, illuminating the ravine in harsh white glare that made the scene even more surreal. The search expanded over the following days. More officers were called in. The entire hillside was combed for evidence, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to find more remains. A severed arm here, portions of legs there. But despite their thorough search, they never found the heads. The killer had taken them or disposed of them elsewhere, denying investigators the most crucial means of identification. The Cuyahoga County coroner, Dr. Arthur Pierce, performed the autopsies in the sterile environment of the morgue, a stark contrast to the wild ravine where the bodies had been found. Under the bright lights of the examination room, the full horror of what had been done to these victims became clear. Both had been decapitated while still alive or very shortly after death. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with medical knowledge or at least butchering experience. The bodies had been drained of blood, though no significant blood evidence had been found at the dump site, meaning the victims had been killed and dismembered elsewhere. Dr. Pierce estimated that the first victim, the more decomposed one, was a male between 35 and 40 years old. He'd been dead for approximately a year. The second victim was younger, perhaps in his late 20s. Based on the condition of the remains, he'd been killed within the past week or two. Both men had been physically fit before their deaths, with developed musculature that suggested lives of manual labor. But who were they? Without heads, without fingerprints, without any personal effects found with the bodies, identification seemed nearly impossible. In 1935, forensic science was still in its infancy. DNA testing didn't exist. Fingerprint databases were limited. Missing persons reports were often incomplete or filed in different jurisdictions that didn't communicate well with each other. The victims were likely transients, Detective May concluded. Men who lived in the shanties of Kingsbury Run or the hobo camps along the railroad tracks. Men who moved from city to city looking for work, who had no fixed address. No family checking on them, no employer to report them missing. They were among Cleveland's invisible population, and in death, they remained unnamed and unclaimed. The newspapers seized on the story immediately. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran front-page coverage with the headline, "Heed lust throws fisher vd." The Cleveland press wasn't far behind. Within days, the story had spread to papers across the country. The details were too sensational to ignore. Headless bodies, precision dismemberment, a killer who might have medical training, victims who couldn't be identified. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Fear spread through the city's transient population. Men who'd been sleeping rough in Kingsbury Run suddenly found other places to spend their nights. The shanty town that had sprawled across the ravine began to empty as its residents scattered to other parts of the city, or moved on to other towns entirely. But for the working-class families in the neighborhoods surrounding Kingsbury Run, the fear was more complicated. These weren't their people who'd been killed, or so they told themselves. These were transients, drifters, men without homes or families. Terrible as it was happening in a world separate from their own. They locked their doors at night and told their children to stay out of the ravine, but they didn't truly believe they were in danger. That assumption would prove to be tragically wrong. Detective May assembled a task force to investigate the murders. They interviewed hundreds of people, residents who lived near Kingsbury Run, transients who might have seen something, railroad workers who passed through the area regularly. They developed lists of men reported missing in Cleveland over the past 2 years, trying to match descriptions to the unidentified remains. They looked into every known sex offender in the city, every person with medical training who might have access to the tools needed for such precise dismemberment. The investigation consumed hundreds of man-hours, but it yielded frustratingly little. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had heard screams or sounds of struggle. The killer had managed to murder 2 men, butcher their bodies, and dispose of the remains without leaving a single useful clue. It was as if he were a ghost, moving through Cleveland unseen and unknown. The investigation slowed as other crimes demanded police attention. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The public's fear faded into uneasy memory. By the winter of 1935, the Kingsbury Run murders had become just another unsolved case in the files of the Cleveland Police Department. A mystery that would likely never be solved. But the killer hadn't stopped. He was simply waiting, planning, selecting his next victim. On January 26, 1936, a young woman was walking near a downtown Cleveland butcher shop when she noticed something disturbing in the bushes near the sidewalk. At first, she thought it was just trash, maybe a bundle of discarded meat scraps from the shop. But something about it caught her eye, made her look closer. It was a human arm severed at the shoulder, wrapped in newspaper. The woman screamed and ran into the butcher shop. The proprietor came out, saw what she'd found, and immediately called the police. Within 20 minutes, detectives were on the scene, carefully unwrapping the newspaper to examine the arm. It was a woman's arm, slender and pale, the hand gracefully formed. The newspaper was several weeks old, suggesting the arm had been there for some time, though the cold January weather had preserved it. A search of the immediate area revealed more remains. Behind the butcher shop, in various locations within a 2-block radius, police found additional body parts, another arm, both legs, sections of the torso. But again, no head. The killer had taken it or disposed of it elsewhere. The victim was a woman in her mid-30s, estimated to have been about 5 feet, 6 inches tall, with reddish-brown hair and painted nails. She'd been dead for approximately 4 to 6 weeks, killed sometime in mid-December. Like the previous victims, she'd been decapitated and drained of blood. The cuts were precise, almost surgical, and like the others, she remained unidentified. Pierce, performing his 3rd torso murder autopsy in less than 6 months, noted the same methodical approach to dismemberment. The killer was using similar techniques, suggesting the same perpetrator. But this victim was different in one crucial way. She was a woman, and evidence suggested she might have been pregnant at the time of her death. The discovery sent shockwaves through Cleveland. The previous victims had been transient men, easy for the public to mentally separate from their own lives. But this was a woman, and that made the threat feel more unipersonal, more personal. If the killer was expanding his victim selection, then no one was truly safe. Detective May and his team redoubled their efforts. They canvassed every hotel, boarding house, and transient shelter in Cleveland, showing sketches of what the woman might have looked like in life. They checked missing persons reports not just from Cleveland, but from surrounding cities and counties. They interviewed prostitutes, hoping someone might recognize a description of the victim or have information about men with unusual or violent proclivities. But once again, the investigation hit walls at every turn. The victim remained Jane Doe. No one claimed her. No one identified her. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field, just another anonymous casualty of the Great Depression. The newspapers dubbed the perpetrator the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, though the latest victim hadn't been found in the ravine. The name stuck. Headlines screamed about the butcher stalking Cleveland streets. Editorials demanded that the police do more, catch the killer, restore safety to the city. Politicians, sensing public anger, began to pressure the police department for results. Detective Peter Marilow, a tough, determined investigator known for his relentless work ethic, was assigned to lead the investigation. Marilow was a street cop who'd worked his way up through the ranks, someone who understood Cleveland's underworld and had cultivated informants throughout the city's criminal networks. If anyone could crack this case, the department believed, it was Marilow. Marilow approached the investigation with methodical determination. He created detailed files on each victim, mapping out where bodies had been found, cataloging every piece of evidence, no matter how minor. He developed theories about the killer's methods, his possible background, his hunting grounds. He believed the killer lived or worked in the area around Kingsbury Run, that he had access to a private space where he could kill and dismember victims without being discovered, and that he likely had medical or butchering experience. But theories, however logical, weren't the same as evidence, and evidence remained maddeningly scarce. The spring of 1936 brought warm weather and new hope for Cleveland's economy, but it also brought new horror. On June 5, 1986, two young boys, why did it always seem to be children who made these terrible discoveries, were fishing in Kingsbury Run when they found human remains in newspaper and burlap. This time, the victim was a young man in his late 20s, heavily tattooed. The distinctive body art gave investigators their first real hope of identification in months. Police released descriptions of the tattoos to the press: an anchor on one arm, a dove, a banner with the word "Eline," and several other designs. Surely someone would recognize these distinctive markings. Surely someone knew this man and would come forward. But weeks passed, and no one claimed him. The tattooed man joined the growing list of unidentified victims. Number 4 in a series that showed no signs of stopping. Detective Merillo worked the case obsessively. He interviewed tattoo artists throughout Cleveland and in surrounding cities, trying to find someone who remembered inking those particular designs. He checked police records for anyone arrested who matched the victim's description and had similar tattoos. He visited every hobo camp and transient shelter, showing sketches of the tattoos, hoping someone would remember a friend or acquaintance who disappeared. The investigation consumed him. Merillo spent 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day working the torso murders. As they were now officially known, he followed up every lead, no matter how unlikely. He re-interviewed witnesses from the previous discoveries, hoping someone might remember a detail they'd previously overlooked. He studied the dump sites, trying to understand the killer's patterns and predict where he might strike next. But the Mad Butcher remained a ghost. On July 22, 1936, the headless, limbless torso of another man was found in Kingsbury Run. This victim was estimated to be in his 40s, well-nourished, with no distinguishing marks. He'd been killed within the past few days. The same precise dismemberment, the same absence of blood at the dump site, the same missing head that made identification nearly impossible. 5 victims in less than a year. The pace of killing was accelerating. The discovery sparked panic throughout Cleveland. The newspapers ran daily updates on the investigation, often sensationalizing details or speculating wildly about the killer's identity. Some reporters theorized that the murderer was a mad doctor. Others suggested a butcher or meat packer. A few even proposed that multiple killers might be working together. The Kingsbury Run area, already largely abandoned by the transient population, became a place of dread. People avoided it even in broad daylight. Parents warned their children away with stories of the Mad Butcher who snatched people and cut them into pieces. The ravine that had once been a shortcut between neighborhoods became a no-man's land. Detective Merillo and his partner, Detective Martin Zalewski, began going undercover in the hobo camps, dressing in worn clothes and living among the transient population for days at a time. They hoped to gather intelligence, to hear things that wouldn't be said to cops in uniform. They slept rough, shared meager meals around barrel fires, and listened to the stories and rumors that circulated among Cleveland's invisible population. It was during one of these undercover operations that Merillo heard something that chilled him to his core. An old hobo, drunk on cheap wine, mentioned a man who sometimes hung around the camps, someone who was friendly and generous, who offered men money for odd jobs. But several of the men who'd gone with him, the hobo said, had never come back. When Merillo pressed for details, what did this man look like? Where did he live? When was he last seen? The old hobo became vague and confused. Maybe he'd seen him a few months ago, or was it longer? He was average height, or maybe tall, or maybe not. He might have had a car, or maybe it was someone else the hobo was thinking of. It was frustrating, maddening. Every potential lead seemed to evaporate upon closer examination. Every witness was unreliable or couldn't remember crucial details. The killer remained faceless, nameless, a phantom who killed impunity and vanished without trace. September 10, 1936, brought another discovery, but this one was different in a way that would fundamentally change the investigation. A hobo searching for scrap metal in a stagnant pool near the Erie Railroad tracks in Kingsbury Run found half of a human torso floating in the murky water. The lower half, from the waist down, was missing. But what made this discovery particularly significant was that the victim's head was found nearby, partially submerged in the same pool. For the first time since the murders began, investigators had a face to work with. The victim was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, with delicate features and wavy brown hair. His head had been severed with the same precise cuts seen in the other victims, but the killer had discarded it this time rather than taking it with him. Why? Had something interrupted him? Had he been in a hurry? Or was this a deliberate change in his pattern, a message of some kind? Detective Merillo rushed to the scene, hoping that this break in the killer's method might finally provide the clue they needed. With the head intact, they could attempt facial reconstruction if necessary. They could circulate photographs. Someone somewhere had to know this young man. The body was recovered from the pool and taken to the morgue. Dr. Peirce performed the autopsy with particular care, documenting every detail that might help identify the victim. The young man had been in good health before his death with no signs of disease or malnutrition. His teeth were in relatively good condition, suggesting he'd had at least some access to basic care. His hands showed no calluses or scarring from heavy labor, which was unusual for the torso victims who'd been identified as likely transients or manual laborers. Over the following days, police scoured the area around the discovery site. They found the victim's remaining body parts scattered in the vicinity: legs, arms, the lower torso. All showed the same methodical dismemberment. The victim had been dead for several days before being dumped, and once again, there was no blood at the scene. The killing and butchering had happened elsewhere. But despite having the victim's head, despite circulating photographs through every police station and newspaper in Cleveland, despite checking missing persons reports and interviewing hundreds of people, the young man remained unidentified. It was as if he'd never existed, as if he'd materialized out of thin air, just to become the Mad Butcher's sixth victim. The failure to identify this victim despite having his face was demoralizing for the investigation team. If they couldn't put a name to someone whose features they could clearly see, how would they ever identify the headless victims? How would they ever establish a pattern that might lead them to the killer? Detective Merillo became increasingly obsessed with the case. His wife barely saw him. He ate irregularly, slept only a few hours a night, and spent every waking moment either working the investigation or thinking about it. His notes and files on the torso murders filled several boxes. He'd created detailed maps of all the dump sites, looking for patterns in the killer's geography. He'd compiled lists of every doctor, veterinarian, and butcher in Cleveland. He'd interviewed medical students at Case Western Reserve University and workers at every meat packing plant in the city. But the Mad Butcher always seemed to be one step ahead, a specter who killed without leaving useful evidence and vanished to the fabric of the city, as if he'd never been there at all. The winter of 1936 brought a temporary lull in the murders. No new bodies were discovered in November, December, or January. Some investigators dared to hope that the killer had stopped, that he'd died or moved away or been arrested for some other crime. The newspapers ran occasional retrospective pieces on the torso murders, but the daily coverage had stopped. Cleveland began to relax, to believe that maybe the nightmare was over. Detective Merillo knew better. Serial killers didn't just stop. They might, for attention to die down, but they didn't simply walk away from the compulsion that drove them to kill. The Mad Butcher was still out there, and he would kill again. It was only a matter of time. Merillo was proven right on February 23, 1937. The upper half of a woman's torso washed up on the beach at East 30th Street at the shore of Lake Erie. The location was significant. This was the first victim found outside the Kingsbury Run area. The killer was expanding his dumping grounds, either because he was growing bolder, or because increased police presence in the ravine made it too risky to continue using his familiar disposal site. The victim was a woman in her mid-20s, well developed and apparently well nourished. Her torso had been bisected at the waist, and as with the other victims, her head and limbs were missing. The body was fresh, killed within the past day or two. The precise cuts, the lack of blood, the methodical dismemberment, all matched the Mad Butcher's signature. The lower half of the torso was found floating in the lake a few days later, about 1,000 yards from where the upper half had washed ashore. Despite an extensive search of the shoreline and adjacent areas, the woman's head and limbs were never recovered. Dr. Peirce, performing yet another autopsy on a dismembered victim, noted that the woman had been approximately 5 months pregnant at the time of her death. This detail, leaked to the press, created a new wave of public outrage. The Mad Butcher wasn't just killing random victims, he was murdering an unborn child as well. The crime felt even more monstrous, even more incomprehensible. Detective Merillo expanded his investigation to include the waterfront areas along Lake Erie. He interviewed dock workers, fishermen, and residents of the lakefront neighborhoods. He tried to determine where the body had entered the water, working backward from currents and tides to estimate a possible entry point. But the lake was vast, and the currents complex. The body could have been dumped anywhere along miles of shoreline. The pregnant woman became victim number 7, and like all the others except the tattooed man, she remained unidentified. She was buried in Potter's Field, her unborn child with her, both unknown and unmourned by anyone except the detectives who'd worked to give them names. On June 6, 1937, the lower half of a man's leg was found floating in the Cuyahoga River near the West 3rd Street Bridge. The discovery triggered a massive search operation. Police boats dragged the river. Divers searched the murky depths. Officers combed both banks, looking for additional remains. Over the next few days, more body parts were recovered from the river, both legs, both arms, both halves of the torso. But once again, no head. The victim was a man approximately 40 years old, heavily built and muscular. He'd been dead for about 5 days before the first parts were discovered. The same precise dismemberment, the same absence of blood, the same impossible to answer questions. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the location. The Cuyahoga River flowed through the industrial heart of Cleveland, past factories and warehouses, under bridges and railroad trestles. Thousands of people worked in the area. Yet somehow the killer had managed to dispose of body parts in the river without being seen. He was either extraordinarily lucky or possessed an intimate knowledge of the area's rhythms, when workers changed shifts, when security was lax, where blind spots existed in the industrial landscape. Detective Merillo stood on the West 3rd Street Bridge, looking down at the murky water below, trying to think like the killer. Where would you park? How would you carry the body parts without being noticed? Would you dump them all at once or make multiple trips? Did you wrap them in something that would sink at first and only surface later? Or did you weight them down and some of the weights came loose? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. The investigation team reviewed footage from the few security cameras in the area, though coverage was spotty at best. They interviewed night watchmen and factory workers who might have been in the area around the estimated time of disposal. They checked vehicle access points to the river, looking for tire tracks or any physical evidence that someone had stopped near the water. Nothing. The Mad Butcher had struck again and vanished again, leaving behind only questions and dismembered remains. On July 6, 1937, exactly 1 month after the previous discovery, the headless body of a woman was found in the Cuyahoga River, snagged on debris near the Lorain-Carnegie Bridge. She was in her early 30s, approximately 5 feet tall, with blonde hair. Her body was still relatively intact, the torso hadn't been bisected, though the head and limbs had been removed. She'd been dead for about 4 or 5 days. The medical examiner noted something unusual during the autopsy. The woman had distinctive scars from previous surgeries, an appendectomy and what appeared to be a procedure to remove her gallbladder. These surgical scars could be incredibly useful for identification if they could find medical records that matched them. Detective Merillo immediately began contacting hospitals throughout Cleveland and the surrounding area. He described the scars, the approximate dates of the surgeries based on how healed they appeared, and the victim's physical characteristics. It was tedious work, requiring hours on the telephone and days of following up on potential matches. Medical record keeping in the 1930s was not standardized, and many hospitals were reluctant to share patient information even with police. After weeks of investigation, they found a possible match. A woman named Rose Wallace had undergone both an appendectomy and gallbladder surgery at a Cleveland hospital several years earlier. Her physical description matched the victim. But when police tracked down Rose Wallace's last known address, they found her alive and well, working as a waitress in another part of the city. It was a devastating setback, for a brief moment. They thought they finally had an identification, a name that might lead to friends, family, associates, people who could provide information about the victim's last days. But it was another dead end in an investigation full of them. The blonde woman became victim number 9, buried unnamed in Potter's Field alongside the others. The summer of 1937 was oppressively hot in Cleveland. The temperature climbed into the 90s day after day. The air felt thick and heavy, hard to breathe. In the industrial neighborhoods, the heat radiating from factory buildings and pavement created a suffocating atmosphere. People slept fitfully, kept awake by the heat and increasingly by fear. The Mad Butcher had killed 9 people in less than 2 years. The pace was accelerating. The dump sites were spreading across the city. No clear pattern had emerged in victim selection: men and women, young and middle-aged, transients and people who seemed to have more stable lives. The only commonality was the method: decapitation, dismemberment, disposal of remains in public places where they would eventually be found. Why did the killer want the bodies found? That was a question that haunted Detective Merillo. The Mad Butcher could have buried the remains or weighted them down in Lake Erie where they might never surface. But instead, he left them where they would be discovered, in Kingsbury Run. Along the riverbank, on the lakefront, it was as if he wanted people to know what he was doing, wanted the city to feel the fear and revulsion that came with each new discovery. Was it ego? Did the killer enjoy reading about himself in the newspapers, seeing the terror he caused? Or was it something darker, a desire to assert dominance over the city, to demonstrate that he could kill with impunity, and the police were powerless to stop him? Merillo filled notebook after notebook with his theories and observations. He was convinced that the killer was someone who moved through the city unnoticed, someone whose presence wouldn't raise suspicion. A doctor making house calls, a butcher delivering meat, a factory worker or railroad employee. Someone who had legitimate reasons to be in different neighborhoods at different times. The detective also believed the killer had a private space where he could work without interruption. A basement, a garage, a workshop. The dismemberments took time and required tools. The bodies had to be drained of blood, which meant the killer needed access to water and a way to dispose of significant amounts of blood without attracting attention. This wasn't something that could be done in a public space, or even in most rental rooms where neighbors might hear or smell something suspicious. But Cleveland was a city of hundreds of thousands of people. How many homes had private basements? How many small businesses had back rooms or storage areas? How many abandoned buildings dotted the industrial landscape? The possibilities were overwhelming. On April 8, 1938, after a relatively quiet winter with no new discoveries, a woman's leg was found on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, near the West 3rd Street Bridge, the same general area where remains had been found the previous June. The discovery triggered another massive search operation. Over the next several days, more body parts were recovered from the river and along its banks. They belonged to 2 different victims, a woman and a man, both dismembered with the Mad Butcher's characteristic precision. Neither victim had a head. Neither could be identified. The woman was in her mid-30s, approximately 5 feet, 5 inches tall, slender build. She'd been dead for about 4 to 6 months, the cold winter water preserving her remains better than summer heat would have. The man was younger, maybe late 20s. Athletic build, approximately 5 feet, 10 inches tall. He'd been dead for a similar length of time. These were victims number 10 and 11, and their discovery raised a chilling possibility. Had the Mad Butcher killed them months earlier, but only disposed of the remains now? Or had he been storing the bodies, keeping them somewhere cold enough to preserve them? before finally dumping them in the river. The idea that the killer might be keeping bodies, storing them like macabre trophies before disposal, added a new dimension of horror to the case. It suggested a level of planning and control that was even more disturbing than the opportunistic killing the investigators had previously theorized. Pierce's examination of the remains supported the theory of delayed disposal. The bodies had been kept somewhere cold after death but before being placed in the river. The question was where? A meat locker, a cold storage facility, a basement in one of the many industrial buildings that lined the river. Detective Merillo began investigating businesses with cold storage capabilities. He visited meat packing plants, ice houses, and facilities with large refrigeration units. He interviewed workers and managers, always watching for any sign of unusual behavior or suspicious activity. But once again, the investigation yielded nothing concrete. The summer of 1938 brought Cleveland's attention to another matter. The city safety director, Elliot Ness, was under increasing pressure to solve the Torso murders. Ness had come to Cleveland in 1935 with a national reputation as the prohibitionist who'd helped bring down Al Capone in Chicago. As Cleveland's safety director, he was responsible for both the police and fire departments. The unsolved Torso murders were becoming an embarrassment to his administration and a political liability. Ness was a different kind of law enforcement official than the detectives who'd been working the case. He believed in modern investigative techniques, scientific analysis, and systematic approaches to crime solving. He assembled his own team of investigators, separate from the regular police department, and began his own inquiry into the murders. This created tension with Detective Merillo and the existing investigative team. Merillo had been living and breathing the Torso case for nearly 3 years. He knew every detail of every crime scene, every piece of evidence, every dead-end lead. The idea that Ness and his team could swoop in and solve the case with their modern methods felt like an insult to the thousands of hours he'd already invested. But Ness had resources that Merillo didn't. He could authorize expenditures for new forensic equipment. He could bring in outside experts. He had the political connections to demand cooperation from other agencies and jurisdictions. If anyone could break the case open, perhaps it was someone with Ness's combination of resources and reputation. On August 16, 1938, 3 men scavenging at a trash dump on East 9th Street and Lakeshore Drive found cloth bundles wrapped with brown paper and tied with cord. When they opened the bundles, they discovered dismembered human remains. The location was significant. It was less than a mile from Elliot Ness's City Hall office. The remains belonged to 2 victims. The first was a woman in her late 30s or early 40s, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall, heavyset. She'd been dead for about a month. The second was a man, approximately 40, 5 to 50 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, stocky build. He'd been dead for a similar length of time. Both victims showed the Mad Butcher's signature dismemberment. Both were missing their heads. But there was something different this time. The way the remains had been wrapped suggested a level of care, almost tenderness. The body parts were carefully bundled, wrapped in cloth before being placed in paper bags. It was different from the casual disposal in Kingsbury Run or the dumping in the river. Was the killer changing his methods? Was this latest disposal more hurried, more makeshift? Or was it a deliberate message, leaving bodies practically on the doorstep of the city's safety director? Pierce's examination revealed that the woman had been killed first, then the man several days later. Both had been dismembered with the same precise technique seen in all the previous murders. The woman had several distinctive moles on her back that might aid in identification. The man had well-developed arm muscles suggesting manual labor, possibly as a bricklayer or construction worker. Despite these details, despite circulating descriptions to every police department in the region, despite checking missing persons reports going back months, neither victim was ever identified. They became victims 12 and 13, buried in unmarked graves alongside the others. The discovery so close to City Hall created enormous political pressure. The newspapers demanded action. Citizens groups called for Elliot Ness's resignation. Politicians who'd once praised Ness's appointment now questioned his competence. The Torso murders had become more than just a police matter. They were a political crisis threatening to derail careers and change the city's leadership. Ness responded with a dramatic and controversial action. On August 18, 1938, just 2 days after the latest bodies were found, he ordered a massive raid on the shantytown in Kingsbury Run. At dawn, police officers supported by firefighters descended on the ramshackle settlement where dozens of transients had been living. The residents were rousted from their shelters, questioned, and in many cases arrested on vagrancy charges. Then the entire shantytown was burned to the ground. Ness justified the raid as a public safety measure. The shantytown was a health hazard, he argued, a breeding ground for disease and crime. By clearing it out, he was protecting the transient population from the Mad Butcher and removing a haven for criminal activity. The newspapers largely supported the action, running photographs of the burning shanties under headlines that praised Ness for cleaning up the area. But Detective Merylow and many other investigators saw it differently. The raid had destroyed potential evidence, scattered witnesses, and eliminated a key area where the killer might have hunted for victims or even lived among the transient population. If the Mad Butcher had been among those rounded up and released, they'd have no way of knowing. The burn operation had set the investigation back, not advanced it. In the months following the raid, no new torso murders were discovered. Some saw this as vindication of Ness's approach. The killer had been disrupted, scared off, perhaps even arrested during the raid on some unrelated charge. The newspapers began running stories suggesting that the torso murders might be over, that Ness's decisive action had ended the killing spree. Detective Merylow wasn't convinced. The timing could be coincidental. The killer might have gone to ground for other reasons. Or maybe he was simply waiting, letting the city relax before striking again. But as months turned into years with no new confirmed torso murders, it became harder to maintain the investigation's momentum. Resources were diverted to other cases. The special task force was gradually disbanded. The files on the torso murders grew dusty in the records room. Yet the case was never officially closed. The murders remained unsolved. The victims largely unidentified, the killer never caught or even conclusively named. For Detective Merylow, it became a personal obsession that would haunt him for the rest of his career and beyond. In his later years, Merylow continued to investigate the case on his own time, following up on tips and theories long after he'd retired from the police force. He filled notebooks with his observations, created elaborate charts connecting possible suspects, and never stopped believing that somewhere in the mass of evidence and dead leads, there was an answer waiting to be found. But that answer never came, at least not in any official capacity. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run remained one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killer cases, a mystery that has fascinated true crime enthusiasts and professional investigators for decades. Who was the killer? How did he select his victims? Where did he murder and dismember them? And perhaps most haunting of all, did he really stop after the summer of 1938, or did he simply change his methods, finding ways to kill that wouldn't be connected to the torso murders? These questions lingered in Cleveland long after the last official victim was found. They became part of the city's dark folklore. Whispered stories about the monster who'd stalked the streets and ravines, who'd killed with surgical precision and vanished like smoke. To truly understand the Cleveland torso murders and their impact on the city, we need to step back and examine the world in which they occurred. Cleveland in the 1930s was a city of stark contradictions. Gleaming skyscrapers rising above sprawling slums, industrial prosperity existing alongside desperate poverty, hope and despair sharing the same streets. The Great Depression had hit Cleveland hard. The city's economy, built on steel production, manufacturing, and shipping, had contracted sharply after the stock market crash of 1929. Factories that had once run 3 shifts a day now stood silent and empty. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives working in the mills found themselves standing in bread lines. Families who'd owned homes lost them to foreclosure and moved into crowded tenement apartments, or in the worst cases, into the shanties that sprang up in the city's forgotten spaces. Kingsbury Run was one of those forgotten spaces. The ravine cut through Cleveland's east side, a natural gully that had been used by railroads since the 1860s. Multiple rail lines converged there. making it an important transportation hub. But the steep sides of the ravine and the industrial nature of the area meant that few people lived there. It became a transitional space, a place people passed through but didn't settle in, except for those who had nowhere else to go. By the mid-1930s, the run had become home to Oneland's largest hobo jungles. Hundreds of men, and some women, lived in crude shelters built from scrap wood, cardboard, and salvaged metal. They gathered around fire barrels for warmth, cooked whatever food they could scrounge or steal, and shared stories about where work might be found or which towns had friendly police who wouldn't roust the homeless on sight. These were America's invisible people, the casualties of economic collapse who'd fallen through every safety net society had to offer. Many were former workers, men who'd lost jobs and then homes and finally hope. Some were veterans of the Great War, unable to readjust to civilian life or suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Others were simply wanderers, people who'd been riding the rails long before the Depression made it a necessity for millions. In this world, people disappeared all the time. A man who'd been sharing a fire barrel one night might be gone the next morning, heading west for California or north to Detroit where he heard factories were hiring. No one kept track. No one filed missing persons reports. The transient population was fluid by definition, constantly shifting as people moved from city to city, always chasing rumors of work or better conditions. This made Kingsbury Run a perfect hunting ground for a serial killer. Victims could be selected from a population that wouldn't be missed, whose absence wouldn't trigger immediate investigation. The killer could observe potential victims over time, learning their habits and vulnerabilities, waiting for the right moment to strike. And in a community where survival meant minding your own business and not asking too many questions, someone who offered a hot meal or a few dollars for help with a job could easily lure a victim away from the relative safety of the camp. Detective Merillo understood this dynamic better than most of his colleagues. His undercover work in the hobo jungles had given him insight into the desperate calculus that governed life on the margins. When you were hungry and cold and hadn't had regular work in months, you took risks. You went with strangers who offered opportunity. You didn't worry too much about whether something seemed too good to be true, because you were so accustomed to things being bad that any possibility of improvement seemed worth pursuing. But understanding the killer's hunting ground didn't bring Merillo any closer to identifying him. If anything, it made the task seem even more impossible. The transient population of Cleveland in the mid-1930s numbered in the thousands. Add to that the workers who passed through the city on freight trains, the seasonal laborers who came and went with agricultural cycles, and the general population of Cleveland itself, approaching 1 million people, and the investigative challenge became overwhelming. Merillo believed the killer was someone who could move easily between different social worlds, someone respectable enough to avoid police suspicion, but connected enough to the margins of society to hunt among the transient population. A doctor who did charity work, a social worker or priest who ministered to the homeless, a businessman whose work brought him into contact with day laborers, someone with a legitimate reason to be in Kingsbury Run, along the waterfront, in the industrial districts where bodies were found. The detective developed a list of suspects over the years, men who fit his profile and who had some connection to the areas where victims were discovered or disposed of. But developing a list of suspects and building a prosecutable case were entirely different challenges. Without physical evidence linking anyone to the crimes, without witnesses who could place a suspect with a victim, without even the ability to definitively identify most of the victims, Merillo had nothing that would stand up in court. One name that repeatedly appeared in the investigation was Dr. Francis Sweeney, a physician who had once run a medical practice in Cleveland, but had descended into alcoholism and instability following the breakdown of his marriage. Sweeney had medical knowledge that could explain the precise dismemberments. He had a history of mental health issues. He'd been known to spend time in the areas where victims were found, and he had the private space and office, access to medical facilities, where the murders and dismemberments could have been carried out. Elliot Ness became particularly interested in Sweeney as a suspect. Ness had connections to Sweeney through Cleveland's social circles. Sweeney was related by marriage to a prominent local congressman. This made the investigation delicate, requiring discretion and solid evidence before any accusation could be made public. In August 1938, shortly after the raid on the Kingsbury Run shantytown, Ness arranged for Sweeney to be questioned. But this wasn't a typical police interrogation. Instead, Ness had Sweeney brought to a hotel room, where he was subjected to several days of questioning, while under the influence of a primitive lie detector test, a polygraph machine that was still experimental in the late 1930s. The sessions were conducted in secret, without lawyers present, in a manner that would be completely illegal by modern standards. Sweeney, who was reportedly drunk during much of the questioning, allegedly made statements that Ness interpreted as confessions or near confessions to the murders. But the statements were ambiguous, possibly the ramblings of an alcoholic being subjected to intense pressure, and the polygraph results were inconclusive at best. Sweeney was never arrested, never charged, never publicly named as a suspect. After the interrogation, he voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital, where he would remain, on and off, for much of the rest of his life. Ness apparently believed he'd identified the Mad Butcher and effectively ended the killing spree by forcing Sweeney into institutional confinement. But without conclusive evidence, without a confession that would hold up in court, without even the ability to definitively prove that Sweeney had access to the locations and tools necessary to commit the murders, the case remained officially unsolved. Detective Merillo was never convinced that Sweeney was the killer. He continued investigating other suspects, other possibilities. He believed the evidence pointed to someone more organized, more careful, more in control than an alcoholic doctor descending into mental illness. The murders showed planning and discipline. The killer had avoided detection for years while operating in a relatively small geographic area. That suggested someone who could maintain a facade of normalcy, not someone spiraling into public alcoholism and instability. But without new victims to investigate, without fresh evidence to pursue, the case gradually went cold. The urgency faded. Cleveland moved on to other concerns: the approach of World War II, economic recovery, new political scandals. The Torso murders became history, their victims buried in unmarked graves, their killer unnamed and unpunished. Yet questions remained, questions that would be debated by investigators and true crime enthusiasts for decades to come. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was the sheer variety in how and where bodies were disposed of. Some were found in Kingsbury Run, scattered across the ravine as if the killer wanted them discovered. Others were dumped in the Cuyahoga River, where they might have floated out to Lake Erie and never been found if not for chance discoveries. Still others were left on lakefront or at dump sites around the city. Was this variety evidence of a disorganized mind, killing impulsively and disposing of bodies wherever was convenient? Or was it strategic? An effort to confuse investigators and prevent them from identifying patterns that might lead to the killer? The medical examiner's report suggested the latter. The dismemberments were too precise, too consistent in technique, to be the work of someone acting in frenzy or panic. This was someone who understood anatomy, who had the tools and skill to separate limbs from torsos with minimal damage to the bone. The cuts showed knowledge of where joints could be disarticulated most efficiently. The draining of blood from the bodies indicated understanding of circulatory systems and access to facilities where such a messy process could be conducted without leaving evidence. Dr. Pierce, who had performed autopsies on all the identified torso murder victims, believed the killer had medical training or extensive experience as a butcher. The technique was too refined to be self-taught. Someone had instructed this person in how to take apart a body, whether in medical school, in an apprenticeship at a meat packing plant, or possibly in military service as a medic or surgeon. This narrowed the suspect pool considerably, or should have. But Cleveland in the 1930s had dozens of doctors, hundreds of medical students, and thousands of workers in the meat packing industry. Without a way to connect a specific individual to the crimes, knowing the killer's probable background didn't bring investigators closer to an arrest. Another puzzling aspect was the question of motive. Serial killers typically fall into certain categories based on what drives them to kill. Some are motivated by sexual gratification. Others kill for power and control. Some are driven by delusions or compulsions they can't resist. But the torso murders didn't fit neatly into any of these categories. There was no evidence of sexual assault on any of the victims. The bodies were dismembered, but not mutilated in ways that suggested sexual sadism. The killer wasn't leaving messages or taunting police with letters, as some serial killers do. There was no obvious financial motive. The victims were largely impoverished people with nothing to steal. And while the dismemberment could be seen as an expression of power over the victims, the clinical precision suggested something other than rage or the need to dominate. Some investigators theorized that the dismemberment was practical rather than psychological, a way to make bodies easier to transport and dispose of, a method to prevent identification by removing heads and fingerprints. But this theory had weaknesses. Why not just bury the bodies? Why leave them where they would inevitably be found? Why sometimes include heads with the remains but other times not? The pattern, or lack thereof, suggested a killer who was evolving, experimenting, changing his methods based on circumstances or impulse. The early victims were all male transients found in Kingsbury Run. Then the killer expanded to include women. Then the disposal sites spread across the city. The number of victims found together varied, sometimes single bodies, sometimes single bunts. The condition of the remains varied, sometimes relatively fresh, sometimes kept for months before disposal. This evolution could indicate a killer growing more confident and bold, or it could suggest increasing instability, a loss of control that might eventually lead to mistakes and capture. But if the killer was making mistakes, investigators couldn't identify them. Each crime scene was meticulously clean of useful evidence. No fingerprints, no footprints, no fibers or hairs that could be traced, no witnesses who'd seen anything helpful. The geographical distribution of dump sites was another puzzle that Merylo spent countless hours trying to decode. He created maps with pins marking where each set of remains had been found, looking for patterns that might indicate where the killer lived or worked. The cluster of discoveries in Kingsbury Run suggested familiarity with that area. The bodies found in the Cuyahoga River could indicate someone who worked in the industrial district or traveled through it regularly. The lakefront discoveries might point to someone connected to shipping or fishing industries, but the maps revealed no clear pattern. The dump sites spread across Cleveland's east side and downtown areas, suggesting either random selection or a killer who ranged widely across the city. Without knowing where the victims had been killed, the actual murder sites, not just the disposal locations, it was impossible to narrow down a geographic profile that would be truly useful. Merylo theorized that the killer had access to a vehicle. Transporting dismembered bodies through city streets, even late at night, would be risky on foot or by public transportation. But a car or truck would provide cover, allow for larger loads, and explain how the killer could range across such a wide area. This was another detail that should have narrowed the suspect pool. In 1930s Cleveland, vehicle ownership wasn't universal, especially among the working class and transient populations. But thousands of people in Cleveland still owned vehicles, and without specific evidence linking a particular car to the crime scenes. This observation led nowhere. As the investigation dragged on without resolution, theories proliferated. Some people believed the killer was a single individual, a lone psychopath operating in the shadows. Others thought there might be multiple killers, either working together or coincidentally committing similar crimes that got lumped into a single case. A few even suggested the murders might be connected to organized crime. Though this theory never gained much traction, the mob killed for specific business reasons, not random selection of transients. And they certainly didn't engage in elaborate dismemberment that would only attract police attention. The most exotic theories proposed that the killer might be someone traveling through Cleveland periodically, a railroad worker, a traveling salesman, a sailor on the Great Lakes ships. This could explain the gaps between murders and the difficulty in identifying a local suspect. But it created its own problems. How would a transient killer have access to the private space necessary for dismemberment? How would he have such detailed knowledge of Cleveland's geography and the transient population's habits? The theory didn't quite fit the evidence. Detective Merilow's own theory, developed over years of investigation, was that the killer was a Cleveland resident, probably middle-aged, probably from a working class or lower middle class background. Someone with medical or butchering knowledge, but not necessarily a licensed professional, perhaps a veterinary assistant, a medical student who'd dropped out, or someone who'd worked in meat packing plants. Someone who owned or had regular access to a vehicle and a private workspace. Someone who moved easily through different social circles and could interact with transients without raising suspicion. Most importantly, Merillow believed the killer was someone who'd learned to compartmentalize, to maintain a normal public life, while harboring dark compulsions he satisfied through murder. This would explain how the killer could operate for years without arousing suspicion from family, friends, or neighbors. It would explain the gaps between killings. Times when the compulsion was satisfied or when circumstances made killing too risky. And it would explain why the murder seemed to stop after 1938. Either the killer had died, moved away, been institutionalized for other reasons, or simply learned to satisfy his urges in ways that didn't leave discoverable bodies. But theories, no matter how logical, weren't the same as proof. And proof was what the investigation lacked from beginning to end. The victims themselves remained largely mysterious, which was perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Torso murders, beyond the obvious horror of the killings themselves. These were people who'd lived lives, had families and friends, experienced joys and sorrows, possessed hopes and dreams. But in death, most of them were reduced to case numbers and clinical descriptions in autopsy reports. The unidentified male victims were all similar in certain ways. They ranged in age from their 20s to their 50s. Most showed signs of lives involving physical labor, calloused hands, developed musculature in arms and shoulders, healed fractures consistent with industrial accidents or hard living. Several showed signs of long-term malnutrition or vitamin deficiencies, suggesting periods of homelessness or poverty. None had dental work of the quality that would suggest middle-class backgrounds or regular access to health care. These were Cleveland's invisible men, the casualties of economic collapse and social breakdown. They lived on the margins, worked when they could find it, drifted when they couldn't. Their deaths barely registered beyond the immediate horror of how they'd died. No one claimed their bodies. No one pressed police for answers about what had happened to them. They were buried in Potter's Field and forgotten by everyone except the detectives who couldn't solve their murders. The female victims presented a slightly different picture, though information about them was even more fragmentary. At least 3 of the victims were women, possibly 4 depending on which remains were counted as separate victims. They ranged in age from their 20s to their 40s. At least 2 had been pregnant at the time of death. Some showed signs of lives involving prostitution or other street-level survival strategies, sexually transmitted infections, signs of past physical abuse, the general wear that came from hard living without access to health care or stable shelter. These women existed in an even more precarious space than the male transients. They were vulnerable to violence from customers, pimps, other street people, and police. Their deaths were often not investigated thoroughly even when foul play was obvious. A dead prostitute in 1930s Cleveland was considered a regrettable, but inevitable consequence of that lifestyle, not a priority for investigation unless the circumstances were particularly brutal or public. That some of these women ended up as victims of the Mad Butcher was almost predictable. They inhabited the same marginal spaces as the male victims, the areas around Kingsbury Run, the waterfront districts, the industrial neighborhoods where transients gathered. They would have been approachable, accustomed to going with strangers for money, less likely to resist an offer of food or shelter, or a few dollars for unspecified work. But even knowing this, even understanding the social dynamics that made these victims vulnerable, didn't bring investigators closer to identifying who'd killed them or why. One aspect of the case that received less attention at the time, but has fascinated researchers since, is the question of whether there were additional victims beyond the officially recognized 13. The count of 13 victims is based on distinct sets of remains discovered between 1935 and 1938. But what about bodies that were never found? What about remains that were discovered but not connected to the torso murders? What about victims whose deaths occurred before the first officially recognized murder in 1935? Some researchers have argued that a headless body found in 1934, before the discovery that sparked the official investigation, might have been an early victim. The dismemberment pattern was similar, though not identical. But because it was found before investigators recognized a pattern, it was handled as an isolated murder and not thoroughly analyzed for connections to the later cases. Other potential victims include unidentified remains found in the years immediately following 1938. Some showed signs of dismemberment, though not always with the same precision as the confirmed torso murders. Were these the work of the same killer, evolving his technique or growing less careful? Or were they copycat crimes or unrelated murders that superficially resembled the torso pattern? The difficulty in answering these questions highlights one of the fundamental challenges of the investigation. Without a clear understanding of the killer's signature, the specific elements that were psychologically necessary to the murders, rather than merely practical, it was hard to definitively say which crimes were connected and which weren't. Modern criminal profiling would focus on aspects of the crimes that served the killer's psychological needs rather than practical purposes. The decapitation, for instance, might be psychologically significant beyond the obvious benefit of preventing identification. Some killers decapitate victims as an assertion of total power, a literal severing of the victim's identity and personhood. Others do it to prevent the victim from watching. For death, a belief rooted in superstition or psychological disturbance. The draining of blood could also serve psychological rather than practical purposes. Some serial killers are fascinated by blood, seeing it as containing the victim's life force or essence. The meticulous draining might indicate a ritualistic element to the killings, something the killer needed to do to achieve whatever satisfaction the murders provided. The disposal of bodies in public spaces where they would be found, rather than burying or completely destroying them, suggests the killer wanted his work acknowledged. This could indicate an egotistical personality, someone who took pride in his ability to kill and evade capture. Or it could suggest a compulsion to share the horror, to make the city acknowledge and fear what he was capable of doing. But all of this is speculation, the kind of psychological profiling that wouldn't become standard investigative practice until decades after the torso murders ended. Detective Merillo and his colleagues were working with the tools and knowledge available in the 1930s, which meant focusing on physical evidence, witness testimony, and traditional detective work rather than psychological analysis of the killer's motivations. The story of the Cleveland torso murders cannot be fully understood without examining the man who became most closely associated with the investigation, Eliot Ness. His involvement in the case, his methods, and his ultimate failure to solve it would define much of how the murders were remembered in the decades that followed. Eliot Ness arrived in Cleveland in December 1935, just months after the first officially recognized torso murder victims were discovered in Kingsbury Run. He was 32 years old, handsome, ambitious, and carrying a reputation that preceded him like a spotlight. As one of the federal agents who'd investigated Al Capone in Chicago, Ness had become a symbol of incorruptible law enforcement, a man who couldn't be bought or intimidated by organized crime. Cleveland's mayor, Harold Burton, had recruited Ness specifically to clean up the city's notoriously corrupt police department. Cleveland in the mid-1930s was plagued by police officers on the take, protection rackets operating openly, and a general sense that law enforcement served the interests of organized crime rather than the public good. Burton wanted someone with Ness's reputation to come in and restore public trust in the police force. As safety director, Ness had authority over both the police and fire departments. He threw himself into the work with characteristic energy, rooting out corrupt officers, restructuring the department's organization, and implementing new training programs. He achieved genuine successes in breaking up gambling operations and reducing the influence of organized crime on city government. For a time, he was exactly the reform-minded leader Cleveland needed. But the torso murders presented a different kind of challenge. These weren't crimes committed by organized criminal enterprises that could be infiltrated or disrupted through traditional investigative means. This was a single individual, or possibly a small group, operating in the shadows, leaving behind only dismembered bodies and questions. Ness's reputation had been built on taking down criminals through systematic investigation, building cases brick by brick until the evidence became overwhelming. But what do you do when there is no evidence to build with? Initially, Ness left the torso investigation to the detectives already working the case, particularly Marilo and Zalewski. He had other priorities, other reforms to implement. But as the body count climbed and public pressure intensified, Ness became increasingly involved. By 1938, with 13 confirmed victims and no viable suspects, the torso murders had become an albatross around Ness's neck, threatening to undermine all his other accomplishments. The contrast between Ness and Marilo was stark, and it created friction within the investigation. Ness was the educated, well-connected outsider, comfortable with politicians and reporters, someone who moved in Cleveland's upper social circles. Marilo was the working, class detective who'd risen through the ranks, someone who understood the streets and the criminal underworld from direct experience. Ness believed in modern techniques and scientific approaches. Marilo believed in leather detective work, endless interviews, and intimate knowledge of the city's rhythms and patterns. Neither approach yielded results, which must have been maddening for both men. Ness brought in outside experts, consulted with the FBI, and implemented new forensic procedures. None of it led to the killer. Marilo spent years going undercover in hobo jungles, interviewing hundreds of potential witnesses, and pursuing every lead no matter how unlikely. None of it produced an arrest. The investigation consumed resources at an unprecedented rate. At various points, dozens of detectives were assigned to the torso case, leaving other crimes under-investigated. The police department's budget strained under the weight of overtime, forensic analysis, and the general expense of such an intensive investigation. Politicians began to ask whether the resources being devoted to finding a killer of transients and prostitutes might be better spent on crimes affecting more respectable citizens. A question that revealed the era's ugly prejudices about whose lives mattered. Ness felt the pressure acutely. His reputation, built in Chicago and burnished in his early years in Cleveland, was beginning to tarnish. Newspapers that had once praised his every move now ran critical editorials asking why the safety director couldn't catch a serial killer operating in his own city. Political opponents saw opportunity in Ness's failure and began positioning themselves for the next election cycle. It was in this context, professional pressure, political vulnerability, and genuine frustration at the investigation's lack of progress, that Ness became fixated on Dr. Francis Sweeney as the probable killer. Francis Edward Sweeney was born in 1894 in Ohio, the son of working-class Irish immigrants. He'd shown academic promise early, eventually attending medical school and becoming a licensed physician. During World War, he'd served as a medical officer, an experience that gave him extensive knowledge of human anatomy and surgical techniques. After the war, he'd returned to Cleveland and established a medical practice. For a time, Sweeney seemed to be living the American dream. He married into a prominent family. His wife was related to Congressman Martin Sweeney, a powerful figure in Cleveland politics. He had a successful practice, a nice home, 2 children. But somewhere along the way, things began to unravel. The exact timeline of Sweeney's decline is unclear, but by the early 1930s, he was struggling with severe alcoholism. His marriage fell apart. His medical practice deteriorated. He began to exhibit signs of mental instability, paranoia, erratic behavior, periods of confusion and disorientation. By the mid-1930s, he was a shadow of his former self, living in transient hotels and declining rooming houses, occasionally seeking treatment at veterans' hospitals for his alcoholism and psychological issues. What made Sweeney to investigators was his combination of medical knowledge, personal instability, and presence in the areas where victims were found. Witnesses placed him in Kingsbury Run area on multiple occasions. He'd been known to interact with the transient population. He had the anatomical knowledge to perform the precise dismemberments, and his mental state suggested someone capable of violence and cruelty. But there was a significant problem with Sweeney as a suspect: his connection to Congressman Martin Sweeney, who was a political rival and personal enemy of Elliot Ness. The congressman and the safety director had clashed repeatedly over police department reforms and the investigation of political corruption in Cleveland. They despised each other with an intensity that went beyond mere professional disagreement. This created a terrible dilemma for Ness. If he pursued Francis Sweeney aggressively, it could be seen as an attack on the congressman, a political vendetta disguised as a murder investigation. If he didn't pursue Sweeney despite evidence suggesting he might be the killer, he was allowing politics to interfere with justice. Either way, Ness was trapped in a situation where his motivations would be questioned and his actions scrutinized. The solution Ness settled on was deeply problematic but understandable given the constraints he faced. Rather than arrest Sweeney publicly, gather evidence through normal channels, and build a case that could be prosecuted in court, Ness decided to interrogate Sweeney privately, determine his guilt or innocence, and then decide how to proceed. In August 1938, Ness arranged for Sweeney to be brought to a hotel room under circumstances that remain murky even today. Some accounts say Sweeney came voluntarily. Others suggest he was essentially kidnapped by Ness's men. What's clear is that Sweeney was held in the hotel room for several days, subjected to intense questioning while connected to a polygraph machine. The polygraph, or lie detector, was still an experimental technology in 1938. Its results were not admissible in court because the science behind it was not yet established. But Ness believed, or wanted to believe, that it could reveal truth that normal interrogation couldn't uncover. He hired a polygraph expert to conduct the tests, while Ness and his team questioned Sweeney about the torso murders. According to accounts from people present during the interrogation, Sweeney was drunk during much of the questioning. This was partly by design. Ness's team apparently believed that alcohol would lower Sweeney's inhibitions and make him more likely to confess. But it also meant that anything Sweeney said was potentially unreliable. The ramblings of an alcoholic under severe psychological pressure rather than genuine confession. The interrogation sessions were brutal. Sweeney was confronted with crime scene photographs, asked detailed questions about the murders, and repeatedly accused of being the Mad Butcher. He was told that the polygraph showed he was lying when he denied involvement. He was kept isolated, denied sleep, subjected to the kind of psychological pressure that would be recognized in later years as producing false confessions. What exactly Sweeney said during these sessions remains a matter of debate. Ness apparently came away believing that Sweeney had confessed, or at least made statements that confirmed his guilt. But there were no court reporters present, no recordings made, no formal documentation of the interrogation. The only records were Ness's own notes and the recollections of the men who'd been in the room. Some accounts suggest Sweeney made incriminating statements, describing details about the murders that only the killer would know. Others suggest his statements were vague and contradictory, potentially the product of a confused mind being told what investigators wanted to hear. Still others suggest Sweeney actually taunted Ness, neither confirming nor denying involvement, playing psychological games with his interrogators. What happened after the interrogation is more clear. Sweeney was released but not arrested shortly afterward. He voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital in Sandusky, Ohio, about 60 miles from Cleveland. He would remain institutionalized, with some brief exceptions, for most of the next decade. Ness apparently believed he'd solved the case. In his view, he'd identified the Mad Butcher, confronted him, and effectively did the killing spree by ensuring Sweeney was institutionalized. The fact that no more confirmed torso murders occurred after August 1938, the same month as Sweeney's interrogation and institutionalization, seemed to confirm this theory. The killer had been neutralized, even if he couldn't be publicly tried and convicted. But this resolution left many questions unanswered. If Sweeney was the killer, where had he committed the murders? Investigators searched locations associated with him, but found no evidence of the kind of kill site the murders would have required. How had he transported bodies while deteriorating into alcoholism and mental instability? Where had he obtained the tools necessary for such precise dismemberment? And most importantly, Could the murder of 13 people really be attributed to someone based on a coerced interrogation conducted in a hotel room without lawyers, proper documentation, or any of the procedural protections that were supposed to protect even the guilty from wrongful conviction? Detective Merillo never believed that Sweeney was the Mad Butcher. He continued investigating other suspects for years after Ness claimed the case was solved. Merillo's objections were both evidentiary and intuitive. The evidence against Sweeney was circumstantial and ambiguous, and Merillo's years of studying the crimes had given him a sense of the killer's personality, organized, controlled, methodical, that didn't match the chaotic deterioration of Francis Sweeney's life. In Merillo's view, the Mad Butcher was someone who could maintain a facade of normalcy while harboring his dark compulsions. Sweeney was too obviously disturbed, too publicly messy in his decline, to have evaded detection while committing such elaborate crimes. A man who couldn't hold his life together enough to maintain his marriage and medical practice seemed unlikely to possess the discipline and organizational ability the torso murders required. But Merillo's objections couldn't change the political reality. Ness had declared victory, even if quietly and unofficially. The newspapers had moved on. The public's attention had shifted to other concerns, and without new bodies to investigate, the case gradually closed itself through simple inertia and fading relevance. The raid on the Kingsbury-run shantytown in August 1938 must be understood in this context. It occurred just days after the discovery of victims 12 and 13. At the height of public pressure on Ness to do something, anything to stop the killings. It happened contemporaneously with the interrogation of Sweeney, suggesting Ness was pursuing multiple strategies simultaneously. The raid was conducted with overwhelming force. Police officers, backed firefighters with hoses and incendiary materials, descended on the shantytown at dawn. The hundreds of people living there were roused from their shelters, questioned, searched, and in many cases arrested on vagrancy or other minor charges. Then the entire settlement was systematically burned to the ground. Ness justified the action as a public health measure and a way to protect the transient population from the Mad Butcher. By destroying the shantytown, he was eliminating the killer's hunting ground and forcing the transient population to disperse to areas where they might be safer. The newspapers largely supported this narrative, running dramatic photographs of the burning shelters under headlines praising Ness for taking decisive action. But the raid was also a public relations move, a way for Ness to look like he was doing something about the torso murders, even if the action didn't actually advance the investigation. It allowed him to project strength and decisiveness at a moment when he was being criticized for the investigation's failures. It gave the public spectacle and visible action when what they wanted was results. The human cost of the raid was largely ignored at the time. Hundreds of people lost what little shelter they had. Their meager possessions were destroyed in the fires. Many were arrested and spent time in jail on trumped-up charges. The transient community, already marginalized and vulnerable, was scattered and traumatized. And crucially, if the Mad Butcher had indeed been someone who moved among the transient population, either as one of them or as someone who hunted among them, the raid destroyed potential evidence and witnesses. Anyone who might have seen something suspicious, anyone who might have known something about the killer's identity or methods, was scattered to the winds or arrested before being properly questioned. From an investigative standpoint, the raid was a disaster. From a political standpoint, it was a success. And that contradiction reveals much about how the torso murder investigation was being driven by factors beyond simply finding the killer. After the raid and Sweeney's institutionalization, there were no more confirmed torso murders in Cleveland. This fact has been used to support the theory that Sweeney was the killer and that Ness's actions, though legally questionable, effectively stopped the killing. But the absence of confirmed murders doesn't necessarily mean the killer stopped killing. There were several unidentified dismembered bodies found in the Cleveland area in the years following 1938. Most were not officially connected to the torso murders because they lacked certain signature elements or because investigators had moved on and were no longer actively looking for connections. But some researchers have argued that these later victims, were the work of the same killer, continuing his work but with a no longer attracted the same level of attention. There were also reports of similar murders in other cities during the 1940s. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania had several cases of dismembered bodies that bore some resemblance to the Cleveland torso murders. The same was true in Youngstown, Ohio, and even in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Were these the work of the same killer, now traveling to avoid the heightened scrutiny in Cleveland? Or were they copycat crimes, unrelated killings that happened to share some superficial similarities? Without modern forensic techniques, DNA analysis, advanced tool mark comparison, detailed behavioral profiling, it was impossible to definitively connect or rule out these cases. They remained, like so much about the torso murders, frustratingly ambiguous. Detective Merylo retired from the police force in 1950, having spent the last dozen years of his career still occasionally pursuing in the torso case. Even in retirement, he continued to investigate, maintaining files and following up on tips that still trickled in. He never accepted that the case was solved. He never believed that Francis Sweeney was the Mad Butcher. Despite Ness's certainty, in his later years, Merylo would sometimes speak to reporters or true crime writers about the case. He remained convinced that somewhere in the mountain of evidence and dead-end leads, there was an answer. He believed that if he could just find the right connection, interview the right witness, examine the evidence from the right angle, the killer's identity would become clear. But that moment never came. Merylo died in 1958 without ever solving the case that had defined his career. His files, his notes, his theories, all passed into police archives where they would gather dust for decades, occasionally examined by researchers but never yielding the breakthrough he'd always believed was possible. Eliot Ness's later life followed a different trajectory. He left Cleveland in 1942, his reputation damaged by the unsolved torso murders and by a drunk driving accident that seemed to confirm rumors about his own drinking problems. He worked various jobs in the following years: federal investigator, private businessman, failed political candidate. He achieved neither the success nor the recognition he enjoyed in his early years. In 1956, Ness collaborated with a writer named Oscar Fraley on a book about his Chicago experiences fighting Al Capone and organized crime. The book, titled The Untouchables, was published posthumously. Ness died of a heart attack in 1957, just before the book became a bestseller and spawned a successful television series. The Untouchables burnished Ness's legend, presenting him as the incorruptible crime fighter who'd brought down America's most notorious gangster. The book and subsequent TV series mentioned the Cleveland torso murders only briefly, if at all. They were an uncomfortable reminder of Ness's greatest failure, a case he'd claimed to solve but never successfully prosecuted, where the killer's identity remained a matter of speculation rather than established fact. In the decades since the murders, the case has been examined and re-examined by researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators. Books have been written proposing various theories about the killer's identity. Documentaries have explored the social context of 1930s Cleveland and the challenges investigators faced. Online forums devoted to true crime have dissected every aspect of the case, debating evidence and theories with passionate intensity. Some researchers continue to advocate for Francis Sweeney as the most likely suspect. They point to his medical knowledge, his presence in the areas where victims were found, his mental instability, and the timing of his institutionalization coinciding with the end of the official murder series. They argue that Ness was right, even if his methods were questionable, and that the case should be considered solved even if formal prosecution was impossible. Other researchers have proposed alternative suspects. One popular theory focuses on a man who worked in a slaughterhouse and had access to all the tools and knowledge necessary for the dismemberments. Another theory points to a physician who worked with the city's transient population and would have had regular contact with potential victims. Still others have suggested that the killer might have been someone completely outside the investigative radar, someone who was never seriously considered as a suspect. Each theory has its proponents and its problems. Each can point to certain facts that support it while struggling to explain contradictory evidence. The truth is that without definitive proof, A confession, physical evidence that conclusively links a specific person to the crimes, or new forensic analysis that wasn't available in the 1930s. The identity of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run remains speculation. What we're left with is the victims, the horror of their deaths, and the reality that justice was never served. 13 people, maybe more, were murdered in brutal fashion. Their bodies were dismembered and discarded like trash. Most were never even identified, never claimed by family, never properly mourned. They were buried in unmarked graves and forgotten by everyone except the detectives who couldn't solve their murders and the researchers who continue to study the case decades later. The Cleveland torso murders stand as a reminder of how vulnerable certain populations are to violence, how difficult it can be to solve crimes when victims are marginalized, and how sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, monsters escape justice. The killer, whoever he was, lived out his life without ever being held accountable for what he'd done. He may have died knowing he'd gotten away with murder, taking satisfaction in having outwitted the police, the famous Elliot Ness, and everyone else who tried to stop him. Or perhaps he died tormented by memories of what he'd done, haunted by the faces of his victims, unable to confess but equally unable to escape the psychological burden of his crimes. We can't know. We can only acknowledge that evil walked Cleveland's streets in the 1930s, left behind broken bodies and shattered lives, and vanished back into history without ever being fully exposed to the light. To understand the full impact of the Cleveland torso murders, we must look beyond the investigation itself and examine how these crimes affected the city, its people, and the broader conversation about public safety, social responsibility, and the dark possibilities that lurk beneath civilized society. Cleveland in the late 1930s was a city trying desperately to believe in its own recovery. The worst years of the Great Depression were behind it. Factories were slowly reopening. Men were finding work again. Families were moving out of tenement apartments and into modest homes in developing neighborhoods. The city's leadership spoke optimistically about Cleveland's future as a major American metropolis, a center of industry and innovation. But the torso murders cast a shadow over all of this optimism. They were a reminder that progress and prosperity were fragile, that darkness could intrude at any moment, that the city's invisible populations lived precarious lives where death could come without warning or explanation. The murders forced Cleveland to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, about the thousands of people living on its margins, about the indifference with which society treated its most vulnerable members, about the limits of law enforcement and civic order. The victims were overwhelmingly people society had already discarded: transients, the unemployed, people with addiction issues or mental health problems, prostitutes, the homeless. These were individuals who'd fallen through every social safety net, who survived day to day without stability or protection. Their deaths were horrific, but in some ways, they were simply violent endpoints to lives that had already been marked by suffering and neglect. This created a moral paradox that Cleveland's citizens struggled to reconcile. On one hand, the brutality of the murders demanded justice. No one deserved to be killed and dismembered, regardless of their social status. The Mad Butcher needed to be caught and punished, both as retribution for his crimes and to prevent future killings. On the other hand, the victims were people most Cleveland residents had actively avoided or ignored during their lives. The same citizens who now expressed horror at the murders had previously stepped over homeless people on sidewalks, averted their eyes from transients begging for spare change, and supported policies that criminalized poverty and homelessness. There was an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance in mourning victims, whose existence they'd barely acknowledged before their deaths. The newspapers of the era reflect this tension. Coverage of the torso murders was extensive and often sensationalistic, with lurid details about dismemberment and speculation about the killer's psychology. But the victims themselves remained largely nameless and faceless in the reporting. They were described in clinical terms: male transient, unidentified woman, victim number 7, rather than as individuals with histories and humanity. When details about victims did emerge, they often reinforced stereotypes and prejudices. A victim identified as a prostitute would be described in terms that suggested her death was somehow less tragic, a predictable consequence of a dangerous lifestyle. Male transients were characterized as hobos and drifters, people who'd chosen lives outside normal society and therefore accepted certain risks. The implicit message was that while murder was wrong, these weren't victims who represented mainstream Cleveland or threatened the safety of respectable citizens. This attitude extended to the investigation itself. Resources devoted to the Torso murders fluctuated based on political pressure rather than investigative necessity. When public attention was focused on the case, immediately after a new discovery or during periods of intense media coverage, manpower and resources flowed toward the investigation. But during quiet periods, when weeks or months passed without new bodies, attention and resources shifted elsewhere. Detective Merillo, who worked the case longer and more obsessively than anyone else, recognized this pattern and resented it deeply. He believed every murder victim deserved the same level of investigation regardless of their social status. He treated the nameless transients found in Kingsbury Run with the same seriousness he would have given to the murder of a wealthy businessman or prominent citizen's child. But Merillo was fighting against institutional and societal indifference. Police departments, like all bureaucracies, responded to political pressure and public demands. When the public clamored for action on the Torso murders, resources materialized. When attention waned, those resources evaporated. The victim's social status ensured that attention would always be episodic rather than sustained. This dynamic revealed something: how society valued different lives. In theory, everyone agreed that all human life was equally valuable, that murder was murder regardless of the victim's circumstances. In practice, investigations were prioritized based on who the victims were and how much political capital could be gained or lost from solving or failing to solve their murders. The Torso murders also exposed the limitations of law enforcement in the 1930s. Forensic science was primitive by modern standards. DNA analysis didn't exist. Fingerprint databases were incomplete. Missing persons reporting was haphazard, with no centralized system for tracking people who disappeared. Communication between different police jurisdictions was sporadic and often ineffective. These limitations meant that even a competent, well-resourced investigation faced enormous obstacles. The killer left few clues at crime scenes. The victims were often impossible to identify. Witnesses were scarce or unreliable. Traditional detective work, interviewing suspects, building cases through accumulated evidence, was difficult when the basic facts about victims and crime scenes remained unknown. Modern investigators, looking back at the Torso murders with the benefit of contemporary forensic capabilities, can only imagine how the case might have been solved with better tools. DNA from the victims could have been extracted and compared to missing persons databases. Tool marks on severed bones could have been analyzed with sophisticated equipment to potentially identify the specific implements used. Geographic profiling could have narrowed down likely locations for the killer's home or workplace. But none of these techniques existed in the 1930s. Investigators worked what they had: autopsy reports, witness statements, crime scene photographs, and their own deductive reasoning. Given these constraints, perhaps the real question isn't why the case wasn't solved, but whether it was even solvable with the technology and methods available at the time. The psychological impact of the murders on Cleveland's transient population was profound and long-lasting. The shantytown in Kingsbury Run, once home to hundreds, was destroyed in Elliot Ness's 1938 raid and never rebuilt. But the destruction was as much a result of fear as official action. People had been abandoning the settlement for months before the raid as word spread about bodies being found in the ravine. Transients developed survival strategies to protect themselves from the Mad Butcher. They traveled in groups rather than alone. They became suspicious of friendly strangers offering work or food. They avoided isolated areas and tried to sleep in places where others could see them. These were sensible precautions, but they also made already difficult lives even harder. The sense of community that had existed in places like the Kingsbury Run shantytown was fractured by fear and suspicion. Some transients left Cleveland entirely, riding freight trains to other cities where they hoped to be safer. Others simply disappeared, either becoming victims themselves or moving on for reasons unrelated to the murders. The fluid nature of the transient population made it impossible to know how many people were affected by the killings beyond the confirmed victims. For the families of the few victims who were eventually identified, the torso murders brought a special kind of grief. Learning that a missing loved one had been murdered was devastating enough. Learning that they'd been decapitated and dismembered, that their remains had been scattered across Cleveland like refuse, added layers of horror that were almost incomprehensible. These families also had to contend with social stigma. If their loved one had been living as a transient or engaging in prostitution, there was shame attached to that reality in 1930s society. Families sometimes faced judgment or blame, as if the victim's lifestyle choices had somehow invited their gruesome fate. This made grieving even more complicated, forcing families to process both their loss and their anger at how their loved ones were being characterized in death. The Mad Butcher became part of Cleveland's folklore, a boogeyman figure that parents invoked to keep children from wandering into dangerous areas. "Stay out of Kingsbury Run or the butcher will get you," became a common warning, transforming a real serial killer into a mythical monster. This transformation served a psychological purpose. Making the killer into a legend somehow made him less terrifying than the reality of an unknown person walking among them, capable of horrific violence. As the years passed and the murders faded from immediate memory into history, the case took on different meanings for different people. For some, it was a fascinating puzzle, an unsolved mystery to be analyzed and debated. True crime enthusiasts pored over the evidence, developing theories and arguing about the likelihood of various suspects. The intellectual exercise of trying to solve the case was divorced from the human tragedy at its center. For others, the torso murders represented a failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. The case became a symbol of systemic indifference to suffering, of how easily people could be victimized when they existed outside mainstream society's protective structures. This interpretation saw the murders not just as the actions of one disturbed individual, but as symptoms of broader social pathologies. For Cleveland's law enforcement community, the unsolved torso murders remained a wound that never fully healed. Generations of detectives looked at the case files, hoping to find something their predecessors had missed. Each new investigative technique that became available was applied to the old evidence, always with the hope that modern methods might finally reveal the killer's identity. But the case remained stubbornly resistant to solution. Physical evidence deteriorated over time or was lost in storage. Witnesses died, taking their memories with them. The social context that had made the murders possible, the Depression-era transient population, the specific geography of 1930s Cleveland, receded into history, making it harder to understand the environment in which the killer had operated. Some researchers have attempted to use modern psychological profiling to create a portrait of the Mad Butcher. These profiles generally describe someone who would have been between 25 and 45 years old at the time of the murders, putting them in the prime of life for serial killers statistically. The methodical nature of the dismemberments suggests someone organized and controlled, able to plan carefully and execute those plans without panic or mistakes. The killer likely had significant anatomical knowledge, whether from medical training, butchering experience, or both. The precision of the cuts, the understanding of how to disarticulate joints with minimal damage to bone, the ability to completely exsanguinate bodies, all point to someone who'd been taught these skills formally or had extensive practical experience. The psychological profile suggests someone who could compartmentalize, maintaining normal social relationships while harboring violent compulsions. This type of individual would have appeared unremarkable to those who knew them. They would have held down jobs, participated in their communities, perhaps even maintained families. Their dark side would have been completely hidden from public view. The selection of vulnerable victims, transients, prostitutes, people on society's margins, suggests someone who understood these populations and knew how to move among them without raising suspicion. The killer might have been someone who worked with the homeless population in some capacity, or who had themselves experienced homelessness or poverty. and knew the community from inside. The disposal of bodies in public places where they would be found suggests a need for recognition, an ego that demanded acknowledgement of the killer's work. This is common among serial killers who see themselves as superior to normal people, who want society to recognize their power and cleverness even if their identity remains hidden. But psychological profiles, no matter how sophisticated, aren't evidence. They describe likely characteristics but can't identify specific individuals. Dozens or even hundreds of people in 1930s Cleveland might have fit the general profile without being the actual killer. Without concrete evidence linking someone to the crimes, profiling alone could never solve the case. The question of why the murders stopped, assuming they did stop in 1938, has generated numerous theories. If Francis Sweeney was the killer, his institutionalization would explain the cessation. But if Sweeney wasn't responsible, other explanations must be considered. The killer might have died. Heart attack, accident, murder by someone else. Any sudden death would explain why the murders ended abruptly. But this theory has problems. If the killer died, there should be some record of it. Death certificates were filed even in the 1930s. Unless the killer died in circumstances where his body was never found or identified, his death should have left some trace. The killer might have moved away from Cleveland. Serial killers sometimes relocate when they feel heat from investigations or when their local hunting grounds become too risky. The similar dismemberment murders in other Midwest cities in the 1940s could support this theory. But again, without definitive evidence linking those crimes to the Cleveland murders, it remains speculation. The killer might have been arrested and imprisoned for other crimes. This is perhaps one of the more plausible theories. If the Mad Butcher was caught committing some unrelated offense, robbery, assault, even a minor crime, and sentenced to prison, the murders would have stopped without anyone realizing they'd caught a serial killer. Prison records from that era are spotty, and without DNA or other evidence to review, it would be nearly impossible to identify which prisoner might have been the torso murderer. The killer might have simply stopped killing. This is rare among serial killers but not unheard of. Some killers experience life changes that allow them to control their compulsions, marriage, religious conversion, development of alternative outlets for their violent urges. Others are frightened by close calls with capture or by changes in their circumstances that make continued killing too risky. If the Mad Butcher fell into this category, he might have lived out a long life in Cleveland, carrying the secret of his crimes to the grave. Each of these theories has advocates among researchers and law enforcement officials who've studied the case. None can be definitively proven or disproven with available evidence. The question of what stopped the murders remains as mysterious as the question of who committed them. One aspect of the case that deserves more attention is the role of media coverage in shaping public perception and possibly influencing the killer's behavior. The Cleveland newspapers provided extensive, often sensationalistic coverage of the torso murders. Headlines screamed about the Mad Butcher and the torso killer. Crime scene details were reported in graphic terms. Speculation about the killer's identity and methods filled column after column. This type of coverage serves several purposes. It informs the public about genuine threats to safety. It holds law enforcement accountable for protecting citizens. But it can also glorify violence and potentially encourage killers by giving them the attention and recognition they crave. Serial killers are often highly attuned to media coverage of their crimes. Some actively court publicity, sending letters to newspapers or leaving clues designed to generate headlines. Others follow coverage closely, using it to gauge police progress and adjust their methods accordingly. The extensive newspaper coverage of the torso murders would have given the killer detailed information about the investigation, potentially allowing him to stay one step ahead of police. The coverage might also have influenced the killer's victim selection and disposal methods. When newspapers reported that bodies found in Kingsbury Run had led to increased police presence in the area, the killer changed disposal locations. When coverage emphasized the difficulty of identifying victims without heads, the killer sometimes left heads with bodies, perhaps as a taunt or a way of increasing the horror. The relationship between media, law enforcement, and serial killers as complex and often problematic. Media outlets want stories that will sell papers and attract readers. Sensational crime coverage does both. Law enforcement wants public cooperation and information, but also needs to protect investigative integrity by not revealing all details. Killers want recognition and often enjoy the fear they generate. These competing interests create a dynamic that can actually impede investigations while appearing to support them. In the case of the Cleveland torso murders, the constant media attention may have pressured law enforcement to prioritize visible action over careful investigation. The raid on the Kingsbury Run shantytown, for instance, was spectacular and generated positive coverage for Elliot Ness, but it likely did more harm than good from an investigative standpoint. The pressure to do something can lead to actions that look decisive but are actually counterproductive. The legacy of the Cleveland torso murders extends far beyond the immediate crimes. The case has been studied by FBI profilers, criminal psychologists, and law enforcement professionals as an example of how serial killers operate and how investigations can be stymied by social factors. Limited forensics and the vulnerabilities of certain victim populations. The case has also contributed to popular culture. Books, documentaries, fictional works inspired by the murders, all have kept the story alive for generations who never experienced the terror that gripped Cleveland in the 1930s. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects of the case, reflecting changing social attitudes and investigative understanding. Some retellings focus on Elliot Ness and his failure to solve Cleveland's most notorious crime, using the case to complicate the simple hero narrative of the Untouchables. These versions examine hubris, political pressure, and the limits of even talented law enforcement officials when facing unprecedented challenges. Other retellings center on the victims, attempting to restore humanity and individuality to people who were reduced to case numbers and clinical descriptions. These accounts research the few victims who were identified, uncovering details about their lives, their families, their dreams. They argue that these were people who mattered, whose deaths deserved more than they received. Still other versions focus on Detective Merillo and his obsessive pursuit of the killer. These accounts portray a dedicated investigator by a case that would define and ultimately defeat him. They examine the psychological toll of hunting a serial killer, the frustration of following hundreds of leads that go nowhere, the haunting knowledge that somewhere out there, a monster walks free. Each perspective on the case reveals different truths. The torso murders were simultaneously a law enforcement failure, a human tragedy, a social crisis, and an enduring mystery. They can't be reduced to a single narrative or interpretation. They contain multitudes of horror, of suffering, of determinated questions. As we approach the end of this dark journey through one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, it's important to examine the specific details that make the Cleveland torso murders so persistently fascinating and troubling, even nearly a century after they occurred. The crime scenes themselves reveal a killer who was both incredibly bold and remarkably cautious. The disposal sites were public places, a ravine used by railroad workers and transients, bridges over the Cuyahoga River, the shores of Lake Erie, a city dump. These weren't remote wilderness locations where bodies might never be found. They were places within Cleveland's urban landscape, areas where discovery was almost inevitable. This choice suggests the killer wanted the bodies found but on his own timeline. By dismembering the victims and scattering remains, he controlled when and how they would be discovered. A complete body left in Kingsbury Run would be found within hours, but body parts wrapped in newspaper or submerged in the river might take days or weeks to surface. This gave the killer time to distance himself from the crime, to establish alibis, to return to his normal life before police began investigating. The disposal sites also demonstrated intimate knowledge of Cleveland's geography and rhythms. The killer knew which areas were deserted at certain times, where security was lax, where he could approach by vehicle without being observed. This wasn't someone randomly selecting dump sites. This was careful reconnaissance and planning. The tools used in the dismemberments have been the subject of extensive analysis. Medical examiners who studied the cut marks on bone determined that the killer used extremely sharp implements, surgical scalpels or high-quality butcher knives. The cuts were clean, showing confidence and skill. There were few hesitation marks or mistakes, suggesting either significant experience or natural aptitude. The killer also had access to the equipment needed to drain bodies of blood. This wasn't something that could be done easily or quickly. It required a space where the killer could work without interruption, where blood could be disposed of without leaving evidence, where the mess inherent in such work could be cleaned up thoroughly. This pointed to a private space, a basement, a garage, a workshop, where the killer had complete control and privacy. Some investigators theorized about specific locations that might have served as kill sites. Abandoned buildings in the industrial district along the Cuyahoga River were considered. Private homes with basements in neighborhoods near Kingsbury Run were scrutinized. Medical facilities where a doctor might have had access outside normal hours were investigated, but nothing concrete ever emerged. The killer's lair, if it existed, remained hidden. The psychological aspects of the crimes are perhaps the most disturbing to contemplate. What kind of person could do this repeatedly? What compulsion drove someone to kill, dismember, and display their victims in this manner? And perhaps most chillingly, how did this person live among normal society, interacting with family, friends, and neighbors while harboring such dark urges? Serial killers often fall into categories based on their motivations and methods. Some kill for sexual gratification, finding arousal in the act of murder or the mutilation of bodies. Others kill for power and control, using murder to assert dominance over victims who represent something they hate or fear. Still others kill for practical reasons, eliminating witnesses, silencing enemies, though this is less common among serial killers who target strangers. The Mad Butcher doesn't fit neatly into any of these categories. There was no evidence of sexual assault on any victim. The dismemberments appeared methodical rather than frenzied, suggesting control rather than rage. There was no apparent financial motive, and no pattern suggesting the victims represented a specific type the killer was targeting symbolically. This ambiguity makes the psychological profile difficult to construct. Was the dismemberment itself the point, a compulsion to take apart human bodies driven by some need we can't understand? Was it practical, a way to prevent identification and make disposal easier? Or was it both, a practical necessity that also satisfied some deeper psychological need? One theory that has gained traction among some researchers is that the killer might have experienced a traumatic event that created an association between dismemberment and power or control. Perhaps he witnessed a terrible accident involving dismemberment. Perhaps he had medical training that desensitized him to cutting human flesh. Perhaps military service exposed him to battlefield carnage that normalized the sight of bodies in pieces. Whatever the root cause, by the time the killing began in 1934 or 1935, the compulsion was fully developed. The killer knew what he needed to do, had the skills to do it, and had arranged his life in such a way that he could kill without immediate detection. This suggests someone who thought about murder for some time before acting on those thoughts. The question of how many victims the Mad Butcher actually claimed remains unresolved. The 13 official victims are those whose deaths showed clear evidence of the killer's methods and signature. But there are other candidates, bodies found before 1935 or after 1938 that bore some similarities but lacked definitive connections. A woman's torso found floating in Lake Erie in 1934 showed signs of professional dismemberment, but was initially treated as an isolated incident. A man's dismembered remains discovered in 1940 near the railroad tracks raised questions about whether the killer had resumed his activities. Several other cases in the Cleveland area during the late 1930s and 1940s involved bodies that were partially dismembered or show their similarities to the torso murders. Were these additional victims, bringing the true count to 20 or more? Or were they unrelated crimes that happened to share some characteristics with the torso murders? Without modern forensic techniques to definitively link the cases, we can't know for certain. The true scope of the Mad Butcher's killing spree may have been larger than official record suggests. There's also the question of whether the killer committed crimes before coming to Cleveland or after leaving. Serial killers rarely start and stop their activities cleanly within a single geographic area. They often have victims in multiple locations over the course of their criminal careers. If the Mad Butcher killed in Cleveland 5 to 1938, what was he doing before and after those years? Some researchers have looked for similar unsolved murders in other cities during the 1920s and 1940s, searching for patterns that might indicate the same killer at work. There are intriguing possibilities: dismembered bodies in Pittsburgh, unidentified torsos in Chicago, mysterious disappearances in cities along Lake Erie. But establishing definitive connections across jurisdictions and decades is extraordinarily difficult without physical evidence that can be scientifically compared. The victims we know about, the 13 confirmed and the others possibly connected, represent human beings whose lives were cut short in the most brutal manner imaginable. They were people with histories, with personalities, with potential futures that were stolen from them. The fact that most remained unidentified is itself a tragedy that compounds the horror of their murders. Consider what it means to die without anyone knowing who you were. Your body is found, examined, cataloged, and buried under number rather than a name. No one claims you. No one mourns you specifically. You become a statistic, a case file, an unsolved mystery. Your life is reduced to physical measurements and autopsy findings. This is what happened to most of the Mad Butcher's victims. The few who were identified fared little better in terms of public memory. Their names appear in police reports and newspaper archives, but they're remembered primarily as victims rather than as individuals. We know how they died, but very little about how they lived. The killer, by robbing them of their lives, also robbed them of their place in history except as footnotes to his crimes. This asymmetry, where the killer's actions are studied and analyzed while the victims are largely forgotten, is common in true crime narratives. We become fascinated by the psychology of killers, by their methods and motivations, while spending less time considering the victims as real people. It's a tendency worth examining and resisting. Each victim of the Mad Butcher had a story before they encountered him. They had childhoods, families, dreams, disappointments, moments of joy and periods of struggle. The transient men living in Kingsbury Run shanties had once been sons, brothers, perhaps fathers. They'd held jobs, had relationships, participated in communities. Economic collapse and personal misfortune had brought them to Cleveland's margins, but that didn't erase their fundamental humanity. The women who became victims had similarly complex lives. They weren't simply prostitutes or transients. They were human beings who'd made choices and faced circumstances that led them to vulnerable positions. Some may have been working to support children. Others may have been struggling with addiction or fleeing abusive situations. Their paths to Kingsbury Run or Cleveland's waterfront districts were as varied as any other group of people. Understanding the victims as individuals rather than categories makes the torso murders even more tragic. These weren't random statistics. These were people whose lives mattered, whose deaths should have been solved, whose memories deserved more than burial in unmarked graves. The investigation itself, for all its failures and frustrations, represented thousands of hours of dedicated work by detectives who genuinely wanted to solve these crimes. Detective Merylo, in particular, sacrificed years of his life to the case. He went undercover in dangerous situations. He worked endless overtime without adequate compensation. He followed leads that went nowhere and interviewed hundreds of people who couldn't or wouldn't provide useful information. Merylo's dedication came at personal cost. His obsession with the case strained his marriage and affected his health. He became known within the department as the detective who couldn't let go, who saw connections to the torso murders in every dismemberment or missing person case. His colleagues sometimes view this persistence as admirable, sometimes as evidence of an unhealthy fixation. But Merylo understood something that others didn't or chose to ignore. These victims deserved justice. The fact that they were transients or prostitutes, or otherwise marginalized, didn't make their murders less worthy of investigation. Every unsolved case represented a failure of the system to protect the vulnerable and punish the guilty. For Merylo, letting the case go cold meant accepting that some lives mattered less than others, a proposition he rejected on principle. The broader investigative team, dozens of detectives, forensic specialists, also invested enormous effort into solving the murders. They processed crime scenes in harsh weather and difficult conditions. They interviewed witnesses who were often hostile or suspicious of police. They reviewed evidence repeatedly, hoping to find something previously overlooked. They worked within the limitations of 1930s forensic science, doing the best they could with the tools available. That they failed to solve the case doesn't diminish the legitimacy of their efforts. The Mad Butcher was careful, clever, and operating in circumstances that made detection exceptionally difficult. He targeted victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. He killed and dismembered them in private locations that were never discovered. He disposed of remains in ways that eliminated most forensic evidence. He apparently never talked about his crimes or exhibited behavior that would draw suspicion. This combination of victim selection, methodical execution, and careful concealment made the torso murders extraordinarily difficult to solve. Even with modern forensic capabilities, DNA analysis, advanced forensic pathology, computer databases, behavioral profiling, the case would be challenging. With 1930s technology and methods, it may have been genuinely unsolvable. Eliot Ness's involvement in the case, while controversial, also deserves nuanced consideration. Ness was a talented investigator who'd achieved genuine success fighting organized crime in Chicago. He came to Cleveland with good intentions and implemented real reforms that improved the police department. His failure to solve the torso murders doesn't erase those accomplishments. But Ness also allowed political considerations to influence his investigative decisions. The interrogation of Francis Sweeney was conducted in secret, without proper legal procedures, because Ness wanted to avoid the political fallout of publicly accusing a congressman's relative. The raid on the Kingsbury Run shantytown was as much about public relations as public safety. Ness's claim to have solved the case privately while leaving it officially unsolved satisfied neither justice nor transparency. These failures reveal the limitations of even talented individuals when operating within systems that prioritize political concerns over investigative integrity. Ness was trapped between his duty to solve crimes and protect citizens and the political realities of maintaining his position and reputation. He navigated those competing pressures imperfectly, making decisions that might have seemed necessary at the time, but look questionable in retrospect. The question that haunts the Cleveland torso murders more than any other is simple. Who was the Mad Butcher? After thousands of hours of investigation, decades of research, and countless theories proposed and debated, we still don't know with certainty. Francis Sweeney remains the most commonly cited suspect, based primarily on Eliot Ness's conviction that he was the killer. Sweeney had the medical knowledge, the instability, and the opportunity. His institutionalization coincided with the end of the official murder series, but the evidence against him was circumstantial and obtained through questionable means. He was never charged, never tried, never conclusively proven guilty. Other suspects have been proposed over the years. A prominent theory points to a man named Frank Dolezal, who was actually arrested in 1939 in connection with one of the murders. Dolezal confessed under interrogation but later recanted, claiming police had beaten him to extract the confession. He died in jail under suspicious circumstances, officially a suicide by hanging, though some questioned whether he could have fished the act given the circumstances described. Dolezal's arrest and death raised more questions than it answered. Was he the Mad Butcher driven to suicide by guilt and fear? Was he an innocent man wrongly accused who took his own life in despair? Or was he murdered to prevent him from revealing something about the real killer or the investigation? Each possibility has advocates, but none can be definitively proven. Other suspects identified over the years include various doctors, butchers, medical students, and individuals with criminal histories. Each had some connection to the case: geographic proximity to dump sites, relevant professional skills, behavioral indicators consistent with serial killers. But none had the combination of evidence and opportunity necessary to conclusively identify them as the killer. The most frustrating possibility is that the Mad Butcher was someone who was never seriously investigated, someone who flew completely under the radar throughout the active investigation and afterward, Serial killers are often described as seeming normal by those who knew them. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, participate in community activities. Their public persona gives no hint of the darkness they hide. If the Mad Butcher was someone like this, someone never suspected, never questioned, never investigated, then his identity may be genuinely unrecoverable. He might have lived out a long life in Cleveland or elsewhere, his terrible secret known only to himself. He might have died decades ago, taking the truth to his grave, leaving behind only the evidence of his crimes and the mystery of his identity. This possibility, that we never know who the killer was, is difficult to accept. Human nature craves resolution, wants mysteries solved and justice served. The idea that someone could commit such horrific crimes and escape all consequences feels fundamentally wrong. But history is full of unsolved cases, crimes where the guilty were never identified or punished. The Cleveland torso murders may simply be one of those cases where the truth remains permanently hidden. As we reach the end of this investigation into one of America's most notorious unsolved mysteries, we're left with more questions than answers. We know what happened. 13 people, possibly more, were murdered and dismembered in Cleveland during the 1930s. We know roughly when it happened and where the bodies were found. We have autopsy reports, crime scene photographs, and thousands of pages of investigative files. But we don't know who did it. We don't know exactly why. We don't know where the murders took place or how the killer selected his victims. We don't know if the killer acted alone or had accomplices. We don't know what happened to the killer after the murders stopped. These gaps in our knowledge are permanent, unlikely to be filled even with advances in forensic science or new investigative techniques. The victims, most nameless, all gone, remain the true tragedy at the heart of this case. They were people whose lives ended in unimaginable horror, whose deaths were never adequately resolved, whose memories have faded into the generalized horror of the Mad Butcher legend. They deserved better. They deserved to be identified, mourned properly, avenged. They deserved a justice they never received. Cleveland itself bears the scars of these murders even today. Kingsbury Run is still there, though the shantytown is long gone and the area has been developed and redeveloped over the decades. The bridges over the Cuyahoga River still stand, though the industrial landscape around them has changed dramatically. The city has grown and evolved, but the memory of the torso murders lingers in its history. For those who study true crime, the Cleveland torso murders represent a perfect storm of circumstances that prevented resolution. Vulnerable victims, limited forensic capabilities, social prejudices that affected investigation priorities, a clever, careful killer who understood how to avoid detection, political pressures that influenced investigative decisions. All these factors combine to create a case that may never be definitively solved. But perhaps there's value in unsolved mysteries, uncomfortable as they are. They remind us that evil exists and sometimes escapes earthly justice. They humble us by demonstrating the limits of human knowledge and capability. They force us to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity, rather than retreating into false certainty. They honor victims by acknowledging that their stories don't have neat endings or satisfying resolutions. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run operated in darkness and returned to darkness, his identity unknown, his fate uncertain. He killed with precision and vanished without trace. He changed Cleveland, haunted its citizens, and created a mystery that has endured for nearly 90 years. He remains one of history's ghosts, a reminder that some questions have no answers, some crimes have no resolution, some monsters are never caught. The victims lie in their unmarked graves, most still unnamed. Detective Merillo died without solving the case that defined his career. Elliot Ness claimed victory but never proved it. The city moved on but never forgot. And somewhere in the accumulated evidence and cold case files, the truth may still wait, hidden in plain sight. As elusive now as it was when the first bodies were discovered in Kingsbury Run all those years ago. We stand at the end of this dark journey with an uncomfortable truth. Justice delayed is justice denied, and in this case justice may be denied forever. The Mad Butcher won. He killed and was never caught. He took lives and kept his freedom. He committed terrible crimes and escaped all earthly punishment. This is the reality we must accept, however much it offends our sense of right and wrong. But we can honor the victims by remembering them, by telling their stories, by acknowledging that their lives mattered even if their deaths were never properly avenged. We can learn from the investigation's failures and successes, using those lessons to improve how we protect vulnerable populations and investigate serial crimes today. We can resist the temptation to sensationalize horror and instead approach these dark chapters of history with appropriate gravity and respect. The Cleveland Torso murders remain unsolved. The Mad Butcher's identity remains unknown. The mystery endures as frustrating and troubling now as it was 87 years ago. But the victims are not forgotten. Their stories, however incomplete, are part of history. And perhaps that is the only justice we can offer them now, the assurance that they are remembered, that their suffering is acknowledged, that their deaths still matter even after all these years. Thank you for listening to this investigation into one of America's darkest unsolved mysteries. If you found this case compelling, leave a comment sharing your thoughts and theories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime history. And now, as we close the file on the Cleveland Torso murders, take a moment to remember the victims. Remember that behind every crime statistic, every cold case file, every unsolved mystery, there are real people whose lives were cut short, whose families still mourn, whose stories deserve to be told. Good night, and stay safe.